In the shattered landscape of post-World War II Europe, as nations rebuilt their armies from the ashes, France was about to design something completely different, something that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about tank warfare. The AMX-13 wasn't just another tank, it was a revolution wrapped in 13 tons of steel, a machine that proved intelligence could defeat brute force, and a design so brilliant that over 25 nations would eventually buy it. This is the story of the tiny French tank with a giant brain. The year was 1946. France was still reeling from German occupation, but its armaments industry was already roaring back to life. The French military faced a unique problem. They needed a light tank that could be airdropped to support paratroopers, something small enough to fit inside transport aircraft but deadly enough to make a difference on the battlefield. The requirements seemed impossible. Lightweight, heavy firepower, high mobility, and the ability to survive combat. Most engineers would have said you can't have all four. The French said, "Watch us." At the Atelier de Construction d'Issy-les-Moulineaux, abbreviated AMX, a team of designers began work on what would become the AMX-13. The name itself was simple, referring to its initial weight of 13 metric tons, but there was nothing simple about what they were creating. The first prototype rolled out in 1948, and when military observers saw it, they knew they were looking at something unprecedented. The AMX-13 was compact, measuring just 4.88 meters long and 2.35 meters tall. It sat low to the ground with a profile that seemed to hug the earth. But the most striking feature, the one that made everyone stop and stare, was its turret, the oscillating turret. Those two words don't sound revolutionary, but they represented a complete rethinking of how tanks could work. In every conventional tank design, the gun sits inside a single-piece turret and tilts up and down on its own axis. The turret rotates for horizontal aiming while the gun elevates and depresses independently inside. The French threw that entire concept out the window. The AMX-13's turret consisted of two parts. The lower half, the collar, connected to the turret ring and provided horizontal rotation just like a normal turret. But the upper half, the body, was where things got wild. The gun was fixed to this upper section, and when you wanted to elevate or depress the gun, the entire top half of the turret tilted. The whole upper turret moved as one unit. This design brought three massive advantages. First, it allowed the gun to sit higher in the turret, giving better depression angles and making hull-down positions more effective. Second, it meant a smaller, lighter turret could house a much larger gun than conventional designs. And third, and this is where it gets really interesting, it made installing an autoloader vastly simpler. Because the gun stayed fixed relative to the upper turret, the autoloader mechanism didn't have to chase the gun's movement. It could remain in perfect alignment with the breech at all times. The autoloader itself was another stroke of genius. Located in the turret bustle, at the rear of the turret sat two revolver-style drum magazines. Each drum held 6 rounds for a total of 12 shells ready to fire. When the gunner pulled the trigger, the autoloader would cycle around from one of the magazines, load it, fire it, extract the spent casing, and be ready for the next shot. The rate of fire was devastating. The AMX-13 could pump out 6 rounds in rapid succession before switching to the second magazine. In a typical engagement where most tanks might get off 2 or 3 shots, the AMX-13 could land half a dozen hits. Think about what this meant in practical terms. You're a tank commander facing an AMX-13. You fire your first shot, you're reloading. The AMX-13 has already hit you twice, you fire your second shot. The AMX-13 has now hit you 4 times. By the time you're lining up your third shot, assuming you're still operational, the AMX-13 has unloaded 6 rounds into you and is either switching to its second magazine or withdrawing to reload. The psychological impact was immense. It fundamentally changed the calculus of tank versus tank combat. But there was a trade-off. Once those 12 rounds were expended, the crew had to manually reload the magazines. This couldn't be done from inside the turret efficiently. The commander and gunner had to open hatches in the turret roof and reload from outside. This process took time, made them vulnerable, and meant the AMX-13 had to withdraw from combat to replenish its ready ammunition. It was a limitation, absolutely, But the French doctrine accounted for it. The AMX-13 wasn't designed to slug it out toe-to-toe with heavy tanks. It was built for hit-and-run tactics, for ambushes, for exploiting weaknesses and vanishing before the enemy could respond. The main gun on the original AMX-13 was a 75mm SA-50 high-velocity cannon. This wasn't some light pop gun. It was derived from the famous 75mm gun on the German Panther tank, one of the most feared weapons of World War II. The French had captured Panther guns during the war and reverse-engineered them to create their own version. At typical combat ranges, this gun could penetrate most tanks of the early 1950s. The ammunition selection was versatile too. Armor-piercing rounds for tanks, high explosive for soft targets, canister rounds for infantry, and smoke for screening. The AMX-13 packed a punch far above its weight class. Protection was the deliberate sacrifice. The armor was thin by any standard. The frontal armor maxed out at 40mm, enough to stop heavy machine gun fire and shell fragments. The sides and turret ranged from 20 to 25mm. The rear was just 15mm. The turret top, hull deck, and belly were a mere 10mm. Against any serious anti-tank weapon, the AMX-13 was vulnerable. A direct hit from most tank guns would penetrate and likely destroy it, but this was intentional. The designers weren't trying to build a tank that could absorb hits, they were building a tank that wouldn't get hit in the first place. The chassis was brilliantly engineered for its role. The engine, a SOFAM model 8GXB 8-cylinder water-cooled petrol engine, ran lengthwise down the right side of the hull. It produced 250 horsepower, which in a 13.7-ton vehicle gave a power-to-weight ratio of about 15 horsepower per ton. That's respectable even by modern standards. Top speed hit 60 kilometers per hour on roads, and the operational range was 400 kilometers. The suspension used torsion bars with 5 road wheels and 2 return rollers per side. This setup provided good mobility over rough terrain while keeping the profile low. The crew compartment was efficiently laid out. The driver sat in the front left, with the engine beside them on the right. This was an unusual arrangement. Most tanks put the engine in the rear, but the rear-mounted turret of the AMX-13 necessitated this layout. The turret, positioned toward the back of the hull, held the commander and gunner. Total crew was just 3 men. No loader was needed thanks to the Autoloader, which saved weight and space. The crew height requirement was interesting. The tank was designed for men no taller than 1.7 meters, about 5 feet 8 inches. This wasn't discrimination, it was physics. The low profile demanded it. Production began at Atelier de Construction Rouen, abbreviated ARE, in 1952. The first tanks were delivered to the French Army in 1953, officially designated Char 13T75 Model 51. The French military loved it. Here was a tank that could keep up with their fast-moving armored cavalry, provide serious firepower in reconnaissance roles, and operate in terrain where heavier tanks would struggle. But the real validation came when foreign militaries started noticing. The export success was staggering. Over the tank's production life, which ran until 1987, approximately 7,700 units were manufactured. Of those, an incredible 3,400 were exported. That's nearly half. The AMX-13 served in the armies of more than 26 nations across every inhabited continent. Israel, India, Indonesia, Singapore, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Argentina, Peru, Venezuela, Lebanon, Morocco, and many others bought the design. Each saw something different in it. Some wanted the firepower, others valued the mobility. Many appreciated the relatively low cost compared to main battle tanks. But all of them recognized the fundamental soundness of the concept. The AMX-13's first taste of combat came in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. French forces, as part of the Anglo-French intervention in Egypt, deployed AMX-13 tanks with the 2nd Foreign Cavalry Regiment in Port Fouad. The tanks performed well in the urban and desert environments, using their speed and firepower to support infantry operations. The Algerian War saw limited AMX-13 deployment. The rough terrain and guerrilla nature of the conflict didn't favor tank operations generally. Some AMX-13s were even fitted with turrets from American M24 Chaffee light tanks for different operational roles. But it was in other nations' hands that the AMX-13 would face its most significant combat tests. Israel became one of the most important users. In the mid-1950s, when much of the world was refusing to sell arms to the young nation, France stepped up. By 1956, Israel had received about 180 AMX-13s. These became the IDF's first modern tanks, complementing heavier British Centurions. Israeli crews appreciated the AMX-13's agility and hitting power. The tank saw action in the 1956 Suez Campaign and played major roles in the 1967 Six-Day War. 3 AMX-13 battalions fought actively across multiple fronts, but the Six-Day War also exposed the AMX-13's limitations. At locations like Rafah Junction and Jarati Pass, Israeli AMX-13s faced much heavier Soviet-supplied Arab armor. T-55 main battle tanks and IS-3 heavy tanks outgunned and outarmored the French light tanks. Losses were heavy. The 75mm gun, deadly against tanks of the 1950s, struggled against the improved armor of newer Soviet designs. After the war, Israel gradually phased out its AMX-13 fleet, eventually selling most of them to Singapore's newly formed army between 1968 and 1969. India's experience showcased the AMX-13 at its best. During the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War, Indian AMX-13s proved their worth in several engagements. In the Chamjorian sector, the 20 Lancers Regiment, equipped with AMX-13s, faced Pakistan's Operation Grand Slam. Pakistani forces attacked with superior numbers, including M48 Patton tanks that outgunned the French vehicles. But Major Bhaskar Roy and his squadron fought brilliantly. Using terrain, mobility, and the AMX-13's rapid-fire capability, they destroyed 13 Pakistani tanks in a single day, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Roy received the Mahavir Chakra, India's second-highest military decoration, for his leadership. The Battle of Asal Uttar in September 1965 became legendary. Pakistani armor, including 5 regiments of M48 Pattons and a regiment of M24 Chaffees, launched a major offensive. They ran into prepared Indian positions, including the 8th Light Cavalry's regiment of AMX-13s working alongside Centurions and Sherman tanks. The Indians had flooded the surrounding sugarcane fields, turning the ground into a quagmire. Pakistani tanks bogged down in the mud while Indian forces using superior positioning and tactics devastated them. The AMX-13s contributed significantly to destroying or capturing about 100 Pakistani tanks while losing only a fraction of their own force. As the years progressed, the AMX-13 evolved. In 1966, French forces began upgrading to the AMX-1390, fitting a 90mm CN-90 F3 gun with improved armor penetration thanks to heat, or high-explosive anti-tank rounds. This variant featured a thermal sleeve on the barrel to prevent distortion from uneven heating. The gun could penetrate significantly more armor than the original 75mm. For export customers, an even more powerful variant appeared. The AMX-13-105 mounted a 105mm CN-105 gun, giving it firepower comparable to many main battle tanks of the era. This version featured improved fire control systems, including laser rangefinders. The basic chassis proved incredibly versatile. Over 100 variants were developed. The AMX VCI armored personnel carrier could transport infantry alongside tank units. The MKF-3 mounted a 155mm howitzer, creating one of the smallest and lightest self-propelled artillery pieces ever built. The AMX DCA fitted twin 30mm Hispano cannons for anti-aircraft defense. There were bridge layers, recovery vehicles, missile carriers fitted with SS-11 and hot anti-tank guided missiles, and even experimental versions with various weapon systems. The chassis was so sound that derivatives continued serving long after the base tank became obsolete. The oscillating turret concept, despite its brilliance, never caught on widely. The Americans experimented with it. The T-69, T-54E1, and T-57 prototypes all featured oscillating turrets with autoloaders. But they were never adopted for service. The complexity, the vulnerability of the split armor, and reliability issues with early autoloaders convinced the U.S. military to stick with conventional designs. Austria's SK-105 Cuirassier, developed in the 1960s, used a turret derived from the AMX-13s, and it was successful in its own right. But otherwise, the oscillating turret remained a distinctly French innovation, brilliant, but ultimately a technological dead end. Yet the AMX-13 itself was far from a dead end. It served for decades. The French Army operated it until the 1980s before replacing it with vehicles like the ERC-90 Sagaï and AMX-10 RC. But in many other nations, the AMX-13 soldiered on much longer. Indonesia still operates modernized versions today with over 275 in service as of 2024. Peru fields 96 upgraded tanks. Venezuela maintains 31. These aren't museum pieces. They're active combat vehicles, updated with diesel engines, improved fire control systems, and modern communications gear. The longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of the design. Yes, the oscillating turret was complex. Yes, the autoloader could be finicky. Yes, the armor was inadequate for modern threats. But the combination of mobility, firepower, and smart tactical employment made the AMX-13 relevant across multiple generations of tank warfare. It fulfilled its original purpose, supporting fast-moving forces and exploiting enemy weaknesses better than almost any comparable design. What made the AMX-13 special wasn't any single feature. It was the holistic design philosophy. The French understood something that many nations missed. In the post-World War II era, with nuclear weapons and mechanized warfare reshaping the battlefield, you didn't necessarily need massive, heavily armored tanks. What you needed was flexibility. You needed platforms that could be produced in numbers, deployed quickly, adapted to various roles, and operated affordably. The AMX-13 delivered all of that. The oscillating turret and autoloader get the headlines, and rightfully so. They were genuinely revolutionary. But equally important was the chassis design, the power-to-weight ratio, the compact dimensions, the ease of maintenance, and the modular nature that allowed for so many variants. The AMX-13 was designed as a system, not just a tank. It was designed to fit into a broader military doctrine that emphasized mobility and firepower over protection. Looking back from the modern era, it's easy to see the AMX-13's limitations. Modern main battle tanks would annihilate it in direct combat. Anti-tank guided missiles make light armor almost suicidal. The three-man crew is small by contemporary standards for the workload involved, but judging it by modern standards misses the point. The AMX-13 was a product of its time, designed for the Cold War battlefield of the 1950s through 1980s, and in that context it was exceptional. The production numbers tell the story. 7,700 units over 35 years. Service in over 26 countries, combat deployments spanning 5 decades. Variants still in active service in 2024. This wasn't a flash-in-the-pan experimental design. This was a successful, proven weapons system that served its operators well. The export success alone, nearly 50% of all production, demonstrates that militaries around the world saw real value in the AMX-13's capabilities. Perhaps the most telling indicator of the AMX-13's significance is how it influenced thinking about light tanks and armored vehicles generally. After the AMX-13, military planners worldwide began reconsidering the role of light armor. The idea that a small, fast tank with a powerful gun and smart tactics could be as effective as a heavy monster in the right circumstances gained traction. The emphasis on mobility and firepower over protection influenced designs from the U.S. M551 Sheridan to the Soviet PT-76 and beyond. The AMX-13 proved that smart design could beat brute force. It showed that innovation in one area, like the autoloader and oscillating turret, could compensate for weaknesses in others like armor protection. It demonstrated that a tank didn't need to do everything if it could do what it was designed for exceptionally well. These were lessons that resonated far beyond France, shaping armored warfare doctrine for generations. Today, surviving AMX-13s sit in museums around the world. The Tank Museum in the UK has one. Military collections in France, Israel, Indonesia, and many other nations preserve examples. Some have been converted into monuments. Others have found civilian use in films and reenactments, and in a few countries, upgraded versions still roll out for exercises and, occasionally, real operations. The legacy endures. The AMX-13 wasn't perfect. No tank is. It had flaws and limitations that became more apparent as technology advanced. But for what it was designed to be, a light, mobile, hard-hitting tank for the mid-20th century battlefield, it was nearly ideal. The oscillating turret and autoloader gave it capabilities that shocked opponents and delighted crews. The compact, reliable chassis made it easy to operate and maintain. The adaptability led to 100 variants serving 100 purposes. The tiny French tank with the giant brain proved that in warfare, as in so much else, intelligence matters more than size. The AMX-13 outthought its opponents, exploited terrain and tactics, and punched far above its weight class. It became an export legend not through marketing hype, but through genuine capability. Militaries bought it because it worked. Crews praised it because it gave them an edge. And historians remember it because it represented a genuine leap forward in tank design. In the end, the AMX-13 stands as a testament to innovative engineering and clear-eyed military doctrine. The French designers who created it understood the battlefield they were designing for and delivered a vehicle perfectly suited to those conditions. The oscillating turret and autoloader were the flashy innovations that caught everyone's attention. But the real genius was in the whole package, the integration of mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility into a cohesive, effective weapon system. That's what made it special, that's what made it legendary, and that's why, nearly 80 years after its design began, we're still talking about the tiny French tank with a giant brain. Thank you for watching until the end. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Have a good day.